The air atop Mount Mahendra Parvata does not move. It suffocates. It is a thick, humid veil that clings to the skin like a wet shroud, smelling of crushed orchids and damp earth. In the year 802 AD, the jungle below is not a resource. It is a green, chaotic beast that has swallowed every man who dared to challenge its borders. But Jayavarman II is not merely a man, not anymore. As the heavy incense smoke curls around his ankles, he feels the weight of the bronze crown. But more importantly, he feels the weight of a vision that will alter the earth itself. He looks out over the horizon and doesn't see a tangle of trees. He sees a clockwork universe of stone and water. On this day, he declares himself Chakravartin, the Universal Monarch, the pivot upon which the entire world turns. This is the moment the Relic of History begins its most ambitious chapter, but every beginning carries the hidden seed of its own destruction. Jayavarman's vision is a magnificent trap. He orders his architects to perform a miracle. They must chain the monsoons. To the Khmer, water is a fickle god, either a drought that withers the soul or a flood that drowns the harvest. Jayavarman decides that he will be the god who tames the god. Thousands of men, their backs glistening with sweat and red clay, begin to dig. They are not just digging canals, they are carving the veins of an empire. This is the birth of the Great Barays, reservoirs so vast they appear as inland seas. They are designed to hold the summer rains, to store the lifeblood of the kingdom, so that even in the parched months, the rice fields remain emerald, green. It is a masterpiece of hydraulic engineering, a hydraulic city that defies the natural order of Southeast Asia. The people look at the water and see security. Jayavarman looks at the water and see power. But to maintain a god's blueprint, the price is blood and absolute rigidity. The system is perfect, but perfection is brittle. The canals are laid out in a grid that mirrors the stars, a celestial map stamped onto the mud of Cambodia. As the city of Angkor begins to breathe, it grows addicted to its own complexity. Every drop of water is accounted for, every overflow directed with surgical precision. The city becomes a sprawling mega-metropolis, eventually housing 1 million souls when the great cities of Europe are nothing but hovels. The hubris is intoxicating. They believe that because they have mapped the heavens, the earth will always obey. They ignore the fact that by clearing the forest to make room for their stone dreams, they are stripping the land of its armor. The roots that once held the soil are gone, replaced by the heavy, unyielding weight of sandstone. As Jayavarman II's life fades, his blueprint remains, a geometric obsession that his successors will expand until it covers the earth. The chapter of the God King ends with a city that is too large to fail. And yet, in the silence of the forest, the first grains of silt begin to settle at the bottom of the canals. The clock has been wound. The empire is a shimmering jewel of engineering, but it is built on the assumption that the sky will never change its mind. As the sun sets on the first era, the water is clear, the rice is plentiful, and the people bow to the stone faces of their masters, unaware that the very system saving them is slowly beginning to choke on its own ambition. The transition from the dream to the reality of stone is about to begin, and the weight of the gods will soon become a burden that no man can carry. The water remains still for now, but the era of soft earth is ending. The kings no longer want to rule the mud. They want to rule the stone. The transition from the era of the first god kings to the reign of Suryavarman II is not merely a change in leadership, it is a change in the very fabric of reality. The wooden palaces of the past, though grand, were mortal. They breathed with the forest, they decayed, they were rebuilt, and they moved with the cycles of life. But as the year 1113 AD dawns, the Khmer Empire decides it no longer wishes to be mortal. Suryavarman II looks at the horizon and demands that the heavens be brought down to earth, solidified in sandstone. He envisions Angkor Wat, not just a temple, but a funeral pyre for the sun, a monument so vast that its shadow will stretch across centuries. This is where the Relic of History truly begins to harden, as the city transforms from a living, breathing organism into a rigid, stone-clad giant that refuses to bend. To build this horizon of stone, the empire must strip itself bare. The demand for sandstone is insatiable, a hunger that consumes the mountains themselves. In the quarries of the Kulin Mountains, miles away, the sound of iron biting into rock becomes the permanent heartbeat of the kingdom. Tens of thousands of laborers, their skin stained by the orange dust of the earth and their eyes clouded by grit, work under a sun that seems to grow more hostile with every forest canopy that is cleared. To move these massive stones, they rely on the very canals Jayavarman designed for life. Huge rafts, laden with blocks weighing several tons each, clog the waterways. The system, once meant for life-giving rice, is now a conveyor belt for the dead weight of monuments. The hubris is staggering. They are using the water to transport the very stones that will eventually contribute to the water's ruin. As the 5 spires of Angkor Wat rise, the city below begins to change. The delicate balance of the hydraulic city is being tilted by the sheer gravity of Suryavarman's ego. To feed the army of builders, the rice paddies must produce more than ever before. The pressure on the land is relentless, a grinding demand for surplus. The engineers, once the heroes of the empire, are now forced to push the irrigation system beyond its natural limits. They build higher embankments and deeper channels, trying to squeeze every drop of utility out of the earth to sustain the construction. But the earth is beginning to push back in a way that is invisible to the eye of a king. Without the trees to hold the soil, the tropical rains wash a fine, invisible silt into the canals. It is a slow, silent poison. A single millimeter of silt a year seems like nothing, but over decades, it becomes a wall. The people, however, do not see the silt. They only see the gold-leafed towers reflecting in the massive moat. They see the glory, not the decay. The narrative of the empire is now one of obsession. Suryavarman II is rarely seen, hidden behind the high walls of his sacred enclosure, obsessed with the alignment of the stones to the movements of the stars. He believes that if the temple is perfectly aligned with the equinox, he will achieve immortality. But while he looks at the constellations, the ground beneath his feet is shifting. The sheer weight of the stone structures, millions of tons of sandstone, begins to compress the soil, causing subtle, lethal shifts in the drainage levels. The water, which once flowed with the grace of a mountain stream, begins to stagnate in certain sectors of the grid. Mosquitoes bloom in the still pools, and the first whispers of fever begin to drift through the wooden huts of the commoners. The coherence of the empire is fraying at the edges, even as its center becomes more solid. The elite have moved into a world of ritual and abstraction. disconnected from the reality of the clogged arteries of their city. They saw the water turning brown. They saw the end coming. And they responded by carving more apsaras into the walls. They believed the beauty of the stone would bribe the gods into overlooking the mismanagement of the mud. As Suryavarman's reign reaches its twilight, the horizon of stone is complete. It is the most beautiful thing the world has ever seen, but it is a crown placed on a head that is starting to ache. The era of the builders is ending, and the era of the faces is about to begin. A time when the empire will try to smile through its own disintegration as the red silt begins to rise. The stones are set, and the gods are housed, but the water is slowing down. The serenity of the temples is about to meet the chaos of the warning. The transition from the rigid, sun-drenched glory of Angkor Wat to the chaotic fever dream of the late 12th century is marked by the acrid smell of wood smoke and the rhythmic, terrifying beat of war drums. The empire had fallen into a brief, violent slumber, its pride wounded by invaders who had dared to sack the holy city. But from those ashes rose Jayavarman II, a king who did not just want to rule, he wanted to dominate every square inch of the Khmer soul. He builds the great city, Angkor Thom, a fortress of the mind as much as of stone. At its center sits the Bayon, a mountain of rock featuring hundreds of massive, serene stone faces. These faces look in every direction, their enigmatic, frozen smiles suggesting a peace that the reality on the ground is beginning to violently contradict. This is the Golden Peak, the absolute zenith of the Relic of History, but it is here that the warning signs turn from subtle whispers into a screaming, vibrant red. To look into the eyes of these stone giants is to see a civilization in a state of profound collective denial. Jayavarman II is an old man in a desperate hurry, and he pushes his people to the physical breaking point to complete his vision of a Buddhist paradise before his time runs out. But the red warning isn't just a metaphor for blood. It is a literal, physical change in the landscape that no one dares to speak of. Because of the massive, frantic pace of construction, the last of the ancient forests surrounding the capital are put to the axe. The hills are stripped bare to provide fuel for the kilns and space for the rice that must feed an army of workers. Without the roots of the jungle to act as a sponge, the heavy monsoon rains begin to bleed the earth dry of its nutrients. The water in the great canals, once the color of the tropical sky, turns a thick, muddy, suffocating crimson. This iron-rich silt flows down from the naked hills, a red tide that begins to settle in the intricate valves and stone gates of the city's heart. The engineering that once saved the city is now its greatest liability, a silver cord that has become a noose. The hydraulic city has become so complex, so hyper-interconnected, that a single failure in one remote sector ripples through the entire metropolis like a tremor. The engineers of the Bayon era are no longer the innovators of the past. They are the panicked janitors of a dying system. They spend their days submerged in the red mud, desperately trying to dredge the silt from the canals. But for every ton they remove, the next storm brings 2 tons back. The city is choking on its own progress. Inside the walls of Angkor Thom, the elite live in a curated world of silk and jasmine incense, looking up at the golden peaks of the temples. They see the serene faces of the king god and choose to believe that as long as the rituals are performed with precision, The red water is merely a test of their faith. They saw the end coming. They saw the canals narrowing and the rice yields dropping, and they responded by building more hospitals and more temples, hoping to cure the symptoms while the disease devoured the foundations. The social contract, the invisible thread that holds 1,000,000 people together, is the next thing to erode. To maintain this sprawling, suffocating infrastructure, the labor tax on the peasantry becomes a death sentence. The commoners, who once saw the king as the divine provider of water, now see him as the insatiable consumer of their lives. The atmosphere in the streets of Angkor is heavy with a silent, simmering resentment that smells of stagnant water and old sweat. The city is a masterpiece of high-stakes drama. 1,000,000 people living in the most advanced city on the planet, yet everyone is looking over their shoulder at the encroaching jungle. The red warning is ignored by the court, but it is felt in the empty, gnawing stomachs of the farmers. They realize that the great Barays are no longer the deep, cool oceans they once were. They are becoming shallow, tepid swamps. As Jayavarman II finally passes into the spirit world, he leaves behind a city that is a literal fortress, but a metaphorical cage of stone. The transition to the next era is a descent into a long, dry, and terrifying silence. The faces of the Bayon continue to smile their frozen smiles, but their eyes are now watching a horizon where the clouds have stopped gathering altogether. The empire has reached its maximum weight, its maximum complexity, and its maximum fragility. The golden peak has been reached, and there is nowhere left to go but down into the dust. The red warning was the final chance to turn back, but the stones were too heavy to move, and the king's ego was too large to bend. Now, the sky is about to turn gray, and a great drought is waiting in the wings to see if the stone gods can bleed. The transition from the frantic, red-stained construction of the Bayon era to the dawn of the 14th century is marked by a silence so profound it feels like a physical weight. For 500 years, the people of Angkor had lived by the rhythmic heartbeat of the sky. They knew exactly when the first scent of ozone and rain would crest over the horizon, turning the gray dust into emerald life. But as the year 1300 approaches, that heartbeat flatlines. The monsoons, the very soul of the Khmer Empire, simply stop coming. This is the moment where the Relic of History shifts from a story of growth to a story of agonizing day-by-day endurance. The hydraulic city, designed to be a masterpiece of water management, suddenly becomes a sprawling, sun-bleached monument to thirst. The drought is not a sudden, explosive blow, but a slow, suffocating grip that tightens year after year. At first, the elite in the heart of Angkor, Thom, dismissed the lack of rain as a temporary displeasure of the ancestors. They order more ceremonies, more blood sacrifices, and more gold to be draped over the stone faces of the Bayon. But as the months turn into years, and the years into decades, the reality becomes a ghost that haunts every street. The Great Barays, those massive, man-made oceans that were the pride of the God Kings, begin to recede, exposing the skeletons of old trees and forgotten shrines. The emerald water turns to a stagnant gray, then to a cracked, mosaic floor of sun-baked mud. The oceans of the empire are evaporating, and with them, the perceived divinity of the king is vanishing into the thin, hot air. For the common people, the drought is a death sentence written in the dust of their ancestors' graves. The rice paddies, which once yielded 3 lush harvests a year, are now nothing but graveyards for parched yellow stalks. The complex network of canals, already choked with the red silt of the previous century, lacks the water pressure to push even a trickle of nutrients to the fields. The system is failing at its most basic, biological level. In the streets of the city, the air is no longer humid and heavy with life. It is dry and thick with the smell of death and wood smoke from the funeral pyres. The people look at the stone faces of the temples, the faces that were supposed to guarantee prosperity, and they see only cold, unmoving rock that offers no shade and no hope. The psychological bridge between the ruler and the ruled begins to crumble. If the king cannot command the rain, he is merely a man sitting on a throne of thirsty stones, waiting for the end. The elite, trapped in their own narrative of eternal grandeur, make a fatal, final mistake. They double down on the status quo. Instead of decentralizing the population or adapting their agricultural techniques to the new reality, they cling to the rigid, failing infrastructure of the past. They attempt to dig deeper into the silted canals, but the labor force is weak, hollowed out by famine and disease. The social structure of Angkor was built on the premise of endless abundance. Without it, the hierarchy begins to rot like a fallen tree. The hydraulic city was a machine that required constant back-breaking maintenance, and that maintenance required a healthy, willing population. As the people flee the city in search of water in the distant, untamed hills, the machine of the empire simply grinds to a halt. They saw the end coming. They felt it in their parched throats and saw it in their empty, rat-infested granaries. And yet, the bureaucracy was too heavy to move, too set in its ways to survive. This era of the Great Silence is a haunting chapter in the human story. It is the moment where the environment proves that it can revoke the lease on a civilization at any time, without warning and without mercy. The grand stone bridges now span across empty, dry gulches where children once swam. The massive moats, once deep enough to drown entire armies, are now shallow enough for a starving dog to walk across. The empire is waiting, suspended in a state of brittle, glass-like desperation. They are praying for the rain to return, but they have forgotten an ancient, terrifying truth. Nature does not give gifts without a price. When the water finally does return, it won't be as a savior to be welcomed. It will be as a destroyer that will wash their world away. The sky is finally beginning to darken, but the clouds are not the familiar blue of a life-giving monsoon. They are a bruised, angry purple, and they are bringing a debt that must be paid in stone. The transition from the cracked, thirsty earth of the Great Drought to the summer of the mid-14th century is not a relief. It is a violent, earth-shattering nightmare. For decades, the heavens had been sealed shut as if by a divine decree. But when they finally break, they do so with the biblical, unforgiving fury. The sky over Angkor doesn't just open, it collapses. This is the moment the Relic of History records the ultimate betrayal of the elements. The monsoons return with an intensity never before recorded in the secret scrolls of the priests. A mega-monsoon that brings 30 years of water in a single catastrophic season. The people, who had spent a generation praying for a drop of moisture to save their dying children, now find themselves screaming at the sky to stop. But the sky is no longer listening to the prayers of men. The immediate problem is the very ground they stand on, the foundation of their empire. Decades of extreme drought had baked the Cambodian soil into something resembling hard-fired ceramic. It is no longer a sponge capable of soaking up the rain. It is a shield. When the first massive high-velocity torrents hit the earth, the water does not sink in. It shears off the topsoil in great muddy sheets, carrying away the fragile wooden huts of the peasants who had stubbornly clung to the edges of the dry canals. But the real, structural catastrophe is occurring deep within the city's stone arteries. The irrigation system, the hydraulic city, was a precision instrument designed for a predictable, manageable flow of water. It was a masterpiece of gravity and balance, and like any precision instrument, it cannot survive a sledgehammer blow to its center. As the floodwaters roar down from the Kulin Mountains, they do not come alone. They carry with them the skeletal debris of a dying forest, uprooted ancient trees, massive boulders, and millions of tons of that cursed iron-rich red silt that had been accumulating for centuries. This debris acts like a battering ram, traveling at terrifying speeds. The water hits the first of the great stone diversion gates, the valves that controlled the lifeblood of the empire, and finds them clogged solid with the sediment of the drought years. With nowhere to go, the water begins to back up, creating massive, artificial lakes where there should be bustling city streets. The pressure becomes a physical, screaming force. In a series of thunderous, bone-shaking cracks that can be heard even over the deafening roar of the rain, the stone embankments of the main canals begin to fail. This is the end they saw coming, but did absolutely nothing to prevent. For centuries, the Khmer engineers had focused all their brilliance on moving water in, never imagining a world where they would need to move this much water out. The exit channels were too narrow. The bypasses were silted shut by decades of neglect, and the great bridges, those soaring symbols of Khmer connectivity, became accidental dams. As the water piled up against the stone arches of the bridges, the pressure eventually exploded in a spray of sandstone and timber, sending tsunamis of mud and debris rushing directly into the heart of the residential districts. The sophisticated Relic of History is being gutted from the inside out by the very element it tried to enslave for 600 years. The city isn't just being flooded, its infrastructure is being physically erased from the map. The elite, watching from the high, dry towers of the central temples, are utterly helpless. From their vantage points of privilege, they see the city they spent 6 centuries building turn into a series of disconnected, drowning islands. The bridges are gone. The canals are now jagged, ruined gullies that resemble the scars of a war. The hydraulic city has been broken into 1,000 pieces that can no longer work together as a single organism. Even when the rains finally subside and the sun returns to mock the ruins, the damage is permanent. The gravity-fed system that relied on precise levels and perfectly clean channels is now a chaotic mess of sand, rubble, and human wreckage. To fix it would require a labor force that no longer exists and a central wealth that has been washed away into the depths of the Tonle Sap Lake. The transition to the next chapter of this tragedy is one of profound, soul-crushing exhaustion. The water has retreated, leaving behind a landscape that looks less like a city and more like a battlefield where nature has won. The people look at the ruins of their canals and realize with a chilling finality that the machine of Angkor is dead. It can no longer feed 1 million people. It can no longer sustain the life of a god king. The silence that follows the flood is even more terrifying than the silence of the drought was. It is the silence of a civilization that has finally realized its gods have left the building and taken the future with them. The transition from the violent external destruction of the Great Deluge to the mid-15th century is a shift from the roar of crashing water to the terrifying silence of treason. The Great Flood had not just broken the stone embankments of the canals, it had shattered the sacred myth of the God King. For 600 years, the people of Angkor had traded their sweat, their sons, and their absolute freedom for a single divine promise, that the king would maintain the cosmic order and keep the water flowing. But as the mud dries into a gray, cracked skin, and the rice fields remain stagnant, choked with the rotting debris of 1,000 homes, that promise is revealed as a hollow, gilded lie. This is a chapter where the Relic of History explores the most dangerous kind of collapse, the one that starts as a whisper in the heart of the peasant and moves upward like a slow poison to the golden throne itself. The city of Angkor is now a ghost of its former self, a giant standing in a swamp of its own making. While the great stone temples like Angkor Wat remain standing, their spires mocking the heavens, the connective tissue of the empire is rotting away in the humidity. The irrigation system, once a marvel of global engineering that made the world jealous, is now nothing more than a series of disconnected, mosquito-infested pools. To repair the breach in the Grand Canal would require the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of workers, a tidal wave of human labor. But as the king's heralds ride through the districts, calling for the people to return to their tools, they find only empty huts and cold hearths. The people are no longer listening. The hydraulic city required a social contract of absolute obedience, and that contract has been washed away in the flood. A new force has entered the city, moving not with the crushing weight of sandstone, but with the revolutionary lightness of the spirit. Theravada Buddhism. Unlike the state-sponsored Hinduism that demanded massive monuments and a rigid, soul-crushing hierarchy, this new faith preaches a different path. It speaks of individual merit, of simplicity, and of a life that does not require the worship of a man-god. It is the perfect antidote to a system that has become too heavy for the earth to bear. The peasants look at the crumbling majesty of the Bayon, with its hundreds of smiling stone faces, and they no longer see a protector. They see a tyrant's vanity. They see the reason their children are hungry. Why slave away for a king who cannot even keep the silt out of the drinking water? Why build more stone mountains when the forest offers peace for free? Inside the palace walls of Angkor Thom, the rot is even more pronounced, smelling of stagnant perfume and paranoia. The royalty, once seen as the literal bridge between heaven and earth, has fractured into a nest of scorpions. Without the massive surplus of rice from the hydraulic city to use as currency, the central government has lost its leverage over the distant provinces. The king's voice no longer reaches the edges of the empire. It dies in the thick, humid air of the palace courtyard. Provincial governors, sensing the terminal weakness at the center, begin to withhold their taxes and their soldiers. The court becomes a place of frantic, petty intrigues, where the elite are more concerned with their ancient lineages and palace protocols than with the fact that the city's defensive moats have turned into shallow, traversable sand traps. They saw the end coming. They saw the rising power of the neighboring kingdoms and the emptying of the city's granaries. And yet, they spent their remaining gold on rituals to appease ghosts that had already abandoned them. The physical decay of the city mirrors this moral and political collapse with haunting precision. Without the constant forced maintenance of the labor gangs, the wooden infrastructure of the city, the homes of the million, the vibrant markets, the grand administrative halls, begins to succumb to the relentless humidity and the hunger of the termites. The jungle, which had been pushed back by the fire and the axe for 6 centuries, begins its slow, quiet, and relentless return. Green vines crawl like fingers over the walls of the elite villas. Trees sprout from the thatched roofs of the abandoned granaries. The city is being digested by the very nature it once claimed to have tamed for eternity. The coherence of the empire is gone. It is now a collection of frightened, isolated neighborhoods, each trying to survive on its own, completely disconnected from a central authority that can no longer provide water, food, or protection. The atmosphere in Angkor is now one of a long, slow, and agonizing goodbye. The markets are quiet. The vibrant trade in silk and spices replaced by the bartering of scraps. The grand processions of elephants and gold-leafed palanquins, which once stopped the heart of every viewer, are now few and far between, looking more like a funeral march than a royal parade. The relic of history here is the realization that a civilization doesn't always end with a climactic battle or a sudden explosion. Sometimes it ends with a sigh as 1 million people simply decide to walk away. They are moving south toward the rivers that still flow and the trade routes that offer a life beyond the stone cage of the capital. The transition to the next chapter is a transition toward the final, inevitable confrontation. As the internal rot weakens the walls and empties the barracks, an external enemy is watching from the west, waiting for the exact moment when the Universal Monarch is nothing more than a lonely man hiding in a beautiful, dying ruin. The smiles on the stone faces of the Bayon have taken on a mocking, cruel quality. They watch as the last of the loyalists pack their meager belongings and slip into the shadows of the forest. The stage is set for the final siege, but the truth is, the city has already surrendered to its own exhaustion. The transition from the slow, agonizing internal decay of the Khmer court to the year 1431 is marked by a sound that the stones of Angkor have not heard in a generation: the rhythmic, heart-stopping thud of war drums. To the west, across the parched plains and through the thinning forests, a new predator has been watching. The Kingdom of Ayutthaya, fueled by the aggressive energy of the rising Thai people and a lean, mobile military machine, has been tracking Angkor's internal rot with the cold, calculating eyes of a scavenger. This is the chapter where the relic of history moves from a tragedy of nature into a tragedy of blood and iron. The Shadow of Ayutthaya falls over the spires of Angkor, but it does not fall upon a fortress. It falls upon a hollowed-out shell that is already trembling in the wind. The siege of 1431 is often romanticized in the songs of the victors as a climactic clash of titans. But the narrative reality was far more haunting and far more pathetic. The great walls of Angkor Thom, designed by Jayavarman II to hold off the entire world, are now manned by a skeleton crew of malnourished soldiers, their spirits broken by years of famine and the feeling that their gods have turned their backs. The hydraulic city, which once used its deep, wide moats as a lethal defensive barrier, now offers the invaders a dry, dusty path to the very gates. Because the canal system had failed and the moats had silted up during the deluge and the subsequent decades of neglect, the natural defenses of the city are gone. The Ayutthayan army doesn't need to build massive, complex siege engines. They simply march their war elephants across the dried mud that was once a deep, water-filled abyss. As the enemy closes in, the atmosphere inside the city walls is one of surreal, suffocating stagnation. The elite are still arguing over ancient protocol and royal precedents, while the shadow of the Ayutthayan elephants grows longer and darker on the sandstone walls. There is no great stand here, no heroic defense to the last man that history loves to celebrate. Instead, there is the cold, sharp sting of betrayal. History whispers through the ruins that the city fell not because the walls were breached by superior force, but because the gates were opened from the inside. A faction of the Khmer court, perhaps hoping to save their own lives or foolishly believing they could rule as puppets for the new masters, strikes a deal in the dark. The Universal Monarch finds himself a prisoner in his own palace, the victim of a system that had become so disconnected from its people that no one was willing to pick up a sword to defend it. The sack of the city is not a chaotic riot. It is a methodical, clinical stripping of Angkor's soul. The Ayutthayan conquerors do not want this land. It is too broken, too silted, and too difficult to manage. They want the wealth, and they want the people. They begin a mass deportation that drains the city of its remaining lifeblood in a single, agonizing week. Thousands of master artisans, court dancers, high priests, and the last of the irrigation engineers are marched westward in chains toward Ayutthaya, taking with them the secret knowledge of 6 centuries of Khmer culture. The gold leaf is scraped from the spires of the Bayon until the stone is raw. The sacred emerald statues are hauled away on ox carts. The royal libraries, filled with centuries of wisdom on palm leaf manuscripts, are burned or looted. The relic of history here is the physical erasure of an empire's memory. The invaders saw the end coming. They knew Angkor was a dying giant, and they arrived simply to harvest its organs before the jungle could claim the rest. The king, in a desperate and final act of survival, manages to escape the carnage under the cover of a moonless night. He flees south, moving toward the junction of the Mekong and Tonle Sap rivers to a small, humble trading post that will eventually be known as Phnom Penh. In that moment of flight, he abandons the stone dream of his ancestors forever, finally realizing that the inland empire is not a kingdom, but a tomb. He leaves behind the horizon of stone and the golden peaks, trading the impossible glory of the gods for the gritty practicality of maritime trade and survival. The transition to the next chapter is a chilling, absolute silence that settles over the valley like a fog. As the Ayutthayan army marches away into the sunset with their loot and their endless lines of captives, the massive gates of Angkor Thom are left standing wide open. There is no one left with the strength or the will to close them. The city is not dead yet, but it has ceased to be a city. It is now a collection of stone monuments standing in a man-made wasteland. The fires of the sack slowly die down, leaving behind a charred, empty landscape where the only sound is the hot wind whistling through the empty eye sockets of the stone faces, The transition from the violent, smoke-choked echoes of the Ayutthayan sack to the mid-16th century is a shift from the world of men to the ultimate world of roots. The massive gates of Angkor Thom, once the most heavily guarded portals in the known world, now hang open like the hollow jaw of a sun-bleached corpse. The people are gone, either marched away in heavy iron chains or fled into the southern marshes to escape the memory of their own collapse. In their absolute absence, a new, patient, and invincible conqueror arrives. It doesn't use bronze swords or armored elephants. It uses the wind, the rain, and the relentless ticking of time. This is the chapter where the Relic of History describes the slow, digestive process of nature as it begins to consume the horizon of stone. The jungle, which had been pushed back for 600 years by the fire and the axe of the god kings, now moves in with a quiet ferocity to reclaim its stolen crown. It starts with the smallest of things, the seeds. Carried by the bellies of birds or the shifting monsoon breeze, tiny, invisible seeds find purchase in the microscopic cracks of the weathered sandstone. They settle in the stone ears of the gods and the hidden crevices of the temple roofs, deep within the shadows where the sun cannot reach. Fed by the intense tropical humidity and the rich, red silt left behind by the Great Deluge, they begin to sprout. At first, they are nothing more than delicate green shoots, fragile enough to be crushed by a finger. But within years, they transform into these silk cotton and strangler fig trees. Their roots are not like the soft roots of the forest floor. They are like liquid stone, flowing downward with a heavy, gravitational intent. They seek moisture in the dark, wrapping themselves around the necks of stone apsaras and prying apart the massive blocks of the temple galleries with the slow, irresistible force of a hydraulic jack. The architecture that was built to last for eternity is now being used as a mere trellis for the wild. The atmosphere in Angkor becomes one of a haunting, eternal green twilight. The sun, which once blazed off the golden spires of the Bayon, can no longer reach the temple floors. A triple canopy jungle forms over the city, turning the grand, once bustling boulevards into dark, mossy tunnels, where the air is thick with the scent of rot and rebirth. The hydraulic city, once the most engineered and controlled landscape on Earth, has reverted to a swamp. The great moats, no longer dredged by the king's sweating laborers, fill with lilies and decaying vegetation, turning into a breeding ground for 1,000 species of vibrant, poisonous insects. The stone faces of the Bayon, those hundreds of serene smiles that once commanded the respect of an empire, are slowly masked by a thick veil of lichen and velvet moss. They look as if they are sinking into the earth, returning to the silence of the mountain from which they were violently carved so many centuries ago. But the city is not entirely empty of life. The transition from a thriving capital to a silent relic is marked by the presence of ghosts, both literal and metaphorical. A few small groups of dedicated monks remain, living in the damp shadows of the ruins, keeping the saffron robes bright against the gray, decaying stone. They are the keepers of a fragmented memory, performing ancient rituals in temples that no longer have roofs, their chants echoing through halls where tigers now roam. They see the end coming. They see the roots thickening like snakes and the stone arches sagging under the weight of the trees, but they do not fight it. They see it as the ultimate Buddhist lesson, the law of impermanence, The commoners who stayed behind in the surrounding valley have reverted to a simpler tribal life, living in small wooden huts nestled between the ruins of the giants. They treat the great temples not as palaces of men, but as sacred, natural caves, the work of a race of gods that lived before the world grew old and weary. The relic of history here is the terrifying, silent speed of nature's recovery. Within a century, the city that housed 1 million people, the center of a global power, is completely invisible from the air. To a traveler passing by on the distant river, there is nothing but an unbroken, undulating sea of green. The massive reservoirs, the Barays that once looked like oceans, are now dense forests where the water is hidden beneath a carpet of fallen leaves. The irrigation canals are indistinguishable from natural winding streams. The engineered universe of Jayavarman II has been completely and utterly overwritten by the organic universe of the jungle. The hubris of stone has been defeated by the patience of the leaf. The transition from the centuries of green, heavy silence to the middle of the 19th century is a violent collision of two worlds that do not, and perhaps cannot, speak the same language. While the jungle had digested the physical city, the memory of Angkor had never truly vanished from the hearts of the Khmer people. It had simply transformed. It had become a sacred ghost, a realm of spirits where the ancestors whispered through the thick curtains of vines. But to the Western eye, fueled by the soot-stained fires of the Industrial Revolution and a rapacious thirst for colonial expansion, the world was merely a map with inconvenient empty spaces waiting to be found. This is the chapter where the relic of history is dragged back into the harsh, clinical light of the modern world, not as a living sanctuary, but as a trophy for the European imagination. The discovery was not an act of finding something lost. It was an act of claiming something that was never truly missing. In the year 1860, a French naturalist named Henri Mouhot hacked through the dense, mosquito-infested undergrowth of the Cambodian interior. His skin was stinging from the bites of 1,000 insects, and his lungs felt heavy with the humid, sweet rot of the forest. He was searching for rare butterflies, but when he looked up through a break in the canopy, he didn't see wings. He saw the 5 towering lotus bud spires of Angkor Wat piercing the emerald sky like the fingers of a buried giant reaching for the sun. To Mouhot, this was not just a ruin. It was a physical impossibility. He wrote in his diaries, with a hand that must have been trembling, that the sight was grander than anything left to us by Greece or Rome. But within his genuine awe, there was a profound and poisonous arrogance. He looked at the local villagers living in their simple wooden stilt houses nearby, and he concluded, without a shred of evidence, that they could not possibly be the descendants of the people who built these stone wonders. He created a narrative that would haunt the region for more than a century, the tragic myth of the lost civilization. The discovery was, in reality, a total rebranding of the Khmer soul. The French protectorate soon followed the footprints of the explorers, and with them came the archaeologists of the École Française d'Extrême-Orient. They viewed Angkor as a giant, broken puzzle that needed to be solved and reassembled by Western logic. They began the Herculean, decades-long task of anastylosis, the process of taking the temples apart stone by stone, numbering them with white paint, and putting them back together. They were trying to clean the history, stripping away the trees and the moss that had become part of the structure's living soul for 400 years. They wanted the horizon of stone to look exactly as it did in the 12th century, ignoring the fact that the jungle's reclamation was a vital, beautiful part of the story. They saw the end coming for the ruins, the collapse of the arches, and the terminal erosion of the carvings, and they fought it with iron braces, cement, and a clinical detachment. They were no longer temples, they were specimens. The atmosphere of Angkor changed almost overnight from a site of quiet, local pilgrimage to a site of global science and colonial pride. The monks who had tended the sacred fires for centuries, even in the deepest darkness of the abandonment, were often sidelined or pushed to the periphery as the experts arrived with their measuring tapes, chemical cleaners, and glass plate cameras. The Relic of History was now a museum under an open sky. The French narrative was clear and broadcast to the world. The Khmer had reached a peak of greatness, collapsed due to their own decadence, and now required the civilized West to safeguard their heritage. This era was a new, subtler kind of conquest. The Ayutthayans had taken the gold. The Europeans took the story itself. They shipped crates of stone heads, severed from the bodies of gods, back to the grand museums in Paris, treating the empire's very heart as interior decor for the drawing rooms of the European elite. The transition from the era of colonial rediscovery to the digital pulse of the 21st century is a journey from mystery to a terrifying, crystalline clarity. Today, the ruins of Angkor stand as the crown jewel of global heritage, a relic of history that draws millions of travelers to stand in the humid pre-dawn darkness, waiting for the sun to crest over the 5 lotus bud towers. But as the shutters click and the tour guides recite the names of forgotten kings, a deeper, more urgent story is being written in the long shadows of the sandstone. We have spent a century admiring the sheer beauty of Angkor, treating it as an aesthetic triumph of a lost people. But we are only just beginning to understand that Angkor wasn't lost. It was a casualty of its own success. The story of the Khmer Empire is not a romantic tragedy. It is a clinical, haunting study in the limits of human hubris. In this final era, revolutionary technology has allowed us to look through the skin of the earth. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, has used lasers to strip away the thick jungle canopy from above, revealing a secret that was hidden for 6 centuries. Beneath the roots and the rot, there lies a gargantuan, interconnected megacity that prefigured our own modern urban sprawls. Angkor was not just a collection of temples. It was a sprawling, engineered organism of 1 million people, bound together by thousands of miles of canals. But this new blueprint of the past has also confirmed the empire's cause of death with chilling precision. The hydraulic city didn't fall because of a single, unlucky invasion. It fell because it was too rigid and too successful for its own good. The Khmer built a system so massive, so complex, and so utterly dependent on a stable environment that when the climate shifted, they had no plan B. They had built themselves into a beautiful stone-lined corner. The ultimate lesson of Angkor is the lesson of the tipping point. For 600 years, the engineers of the God Kings could fix a broken water gate or dredge a silted canal. They lived under the grand illusion of control, believing that their technology had made them masters of the monsoon. But civilizations are like complex machines. You can replace the parts for a long time, but eventually, the structural fatigue becomes terminal. By the time the Great Drought hit in 1300, followed by the catastrophic deluge, the machine of Angkor was too heavy to pivot. The elite were too invested in the old ways. The grand rituals, the massive monuments, the centralized power to listen to what the ground was telling them. They saw the end coming. They saw the red silt rising. They saw the empty granaries, and they saw the water retreating. And yet, their only answer was to carve more stone faces to smile at a world that was already dying. Today, as we look at this relic of history, we are no longer looking at an ancient curiosity. We are looking into a mirror. Our modern world is also a hydraulic city, though our water is electricity, data, and fossil fuels. We have built a global infrastructure that is just as complex, just as interconnected, and just as dangerously rigid as the stone canals of Jayavarman II. We too are stripping the forests, and we too are watching the red warning of rising temperatures, shifting seasons, and erratic weather patterns. The faces of the Bayon are no longer just portraits of Khmer kings. They are a reflection of us. They represent the universal human tendency to believe that our genius makes us immune to the laws of nature. Angkor tells us that stone does not grant immortality. Only the ability to adapt, to listen, and to change can save a civilization from the jungle. The story of Angkor ends where it began, with the water. As the sun sets over the Great Barays today, the water is still there, reflecting the same stars that Jayavarman II gazed upon in the year 802. The jungle has been pushed back once more by the hands of restorers, and the stones have been cleaned of their moss. But the true relic isn't the temple itself. It is the silence that follows the collapse of an empire that refused to change its mind. The city saw the end coming and chose the comfort of its traditions over the harsh reality of survival. The question that lingers in the humid air of Cambodia and in the boardrooms of our own modern cities is whether we have the courage to do what the God Kings could not. Do we have the strength to bend before we break? The sun has finally set over the horizon of stone, and the echoes of the Khmer Empire return to the silence of the jungle. We have traveled from the first divine blueprint to the final, crushing deluge, watching as a million souls built a world they believed was eternal, only to see it reclaimed by the very nature they tried to tame. But while the stones of Angkor may fall, their story lives on through you. Thank you for walking this path with us. Your curiosity is what keeps these ancient memories alive, and your support is the foundation of everything we do. By watching this saga to the end, you have become a keeper of the relic of history. If these stones have spoken to you, please subscribe and join our community of explorers. Tell us in the comments, which lost world should we exhume next? The archives are vast, and the next discovery is already waiting in the shadows. Thank you for watching Relic of History. Until the next chapter, remember, the past is never truly gone. It is simply waiting for someone to listen.